Okay, hey guys. I wanted to go over Exodus 2, uh, while we're at it before I get into Exodus 3 and 4 this week. Again, I'm using the net version. That's the New English translation. I'm not going to use this translation for the rest of Exodus. I don't really like it for the book of Exodus. You can use whatever version you want. But starting in Exodus 2, verse 1, it says, "A man from the household of Levi married a woman who was a descendant of Levi. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a healthy child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she was no longer able to hide him, she took papyrus basket, I can't say that word, and hid him, sealed him in it with pitch. She put the child in the basket and set it among the reeds along the edge of the Nile River. His sister stationed herself at a distance to find out what would happen to him." So Moses' parents from historical documentation's names are Amram, and his mother's name was Jochebed. That's the English pronunciation. And so what we know about Moses' family is that they're both Levites. They're both from the tribe of Levi. And his family will have eventually an anointing on it to minister. We'll see that with Aaron and Moses. Even his sister Miriam, will be called into ministry. And so this version says he was a healthy child. The NIV and the Complete Jewish Bible says he was a fine child or a beautiful child. I think the New King James Version says she saw that he was a beautiful child. The word fine means exceptional. He was a fine child, meaning he was an exceptional child. Something was different about this infant. And so there's an emphasis with that particular verse that there is a calling on Moses' life that his parents recognized. And it kind of prompted them to take this leap of faith in saving their son with this drastic measure. And so I think that reminds us that as parents, we're called to help our children discover their anointing. And so what stands out about Moses' mother is her incredible faith. And I've done a whole Mother's Day sermon over that. But we want to stick to the scriptures here. But she just had this incredible faith, which is revealed in her defying the Pharaoh's orders, which is what she had to do to give her baby up to be drowned. And so you have to remember in chapter 1, all the Egyptians were called to be on the lookout for any male infants, and if they found a male infant, to throw the infant into the Nile River. And so to hide a baby at this point would have been almost impossible because everybody's on the lookout for male babies. But I think what we see right in this passage is that God meets us where we're at. I want you to remember that this mother, Moses' mother, is surrounded by oppression, misery, and murder, and cruelty, just to name a few. That's what her culture is like for Hebrew people. But even in the hostile environment that she's in, her faith found a way to cultivate, to grow and persevere, which I find incredibly encouraging. And I think this is a great example of God developing faith out of a very dysfunctional society, right? Moses' mother is in a very dysfunctional society, one that doesn't really regard life as precious or valuable, especially Hebrew. They're slaves to the Egyptians, and yet she finds a way out of all these people to cultivate her faith and to put her hope in the Lord. It would have been easy to have given in to that oppression and let it overwhelm you. But she refuses to do that. And I think that's just an incredible thing. And so I think that's an example for us as believers. This one woman had the tenacity to step out and believe God was capable, but not only that, but that he actually would work on behalf of her child and save him. So one small step of faith done in boldness made all the difference for the nation of Israel. And so Matthew Henry says her faith set her above the fears of others, which I applaud and find encouraging. When we move on to verse 5, it says, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself by the Nile with her attendants. Her attendants were walking alongside the river. She saw that the basket was among the reeds, and she sent her attendants, took it, and opened it, and she saw a child, a boy, crying, and she felt compassion for him. And she said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get a nursing woman for you from the Hebrews, so that she may nurse a child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go, do so. So the young girl went and got the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. So, again, I want to point out that the devil was using the baby's cries against them, revealing their location and condemning them to death in the Nile River, because no mother, no rationally sane, loving parent is going to just hand over their child to be thrown into the river. They would have hid their children. But, people were on the alert for babies crying and to investigate if it was a male or female. And so what we see in this passage, what God does is he uses Moses' cry to prompt the princess to compassion for Moses. What the devil would have used to destroy Moses, God uses to save him. And so I think it's important that what we see in the scripture right here is never underestimate the ways of God in your particular situation. God can use whatever is available. And we'll see that later on in chapter 3 with Moses and God calling him into ministry. In our darkest moments, we're not alone. Even though Moses is alone in that basket as a baby, he's really not alone. And I want to note that the princess, in my opinion, had some gumption. She had some gumption to defy her father and pick up this, Hebrew baby and say, I'm going to adopt him and take care of him, and he's not going to be drowned. And so she was kind of this act of righteousness in a society that was full of wickedness. In verses 9 through 10, Moses is adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter, but his own mother was rewarded and paid to take care of her own child. So Moses would have stayed with his family until he was weaned, which would have been in between 2 and 3. This meant his mother got to see all his first milestones, which I just find so incredibly compassionate and loving of God to allow his mother to be part of those. The first time he ate solid food, the first time he walked and babbled, and all those things that we get to experience as parents for the first time with our children. And I think God blesses her with that for her courageous faith. Faith is rewarded. And she was able to set a foundation of faith in Moses' life. Even though he was sent to live among the royals, he still had this foundation of faith set by his mother. And so what we see with Moses is he's highly educated. He goes from his Hebrew birth family to this royal family of the Pharaoh's family. And he's highly educated. He would have learned many skills within the 40 years that he was living within the royal family for Egyptian society. And Egypt was a highly sophisticated society, very above its time. It was it had evolving medicine practices, especially with their embalming. They were very skilled administrators. They had a very advanced calendar that we still use today. They had written language. And so, they were highly sophisticated. And God would have used Moses' time, and he did use Moses' time with the Egyptians to further his cause, to further God's cause. So Moses acquired a lot of skills during his time with the royal family that God would later use to his advantage to lead the Israelites out and for Moses to lead this kind of motley group of people. And so when we move on in the chapter, it says, in those days when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and observed their hard labor. And he saw an Egyptian man attacking a Hebrew man, one of his own people. He looked this way and that way and saw that no one was there. Then he attacked the Egyptian and concealed the body in the sand. When he went out the next day, there were 2 Hebrew men fighting, and he said to the one who was in the wrong, why are you attacking your fellow Hebrew? The man replied, who made you a ruler and judge over us? Are you planning to kill me like you killed that Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid, thinking, surely what I did has become known. When Pharaoh heard about this event, he sought to kill Moses, so Moses fled from Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he settled by a certain well. So Moses was afraid. Let me just say this. Moses was raised by Egyptians, but he identified with the Israelites. Those were his people. And so he wanted to rescue his people from the harsh conditions that they lived by and lived under. And so he always identifies, what you see with the character of Moses, what Moses' character is known for, is always identifying with righteousness and justice, no matter what situation he's in. Even in the next paragraph, you're going to see him identify with justice and righteousness. But he had a zeal for righteousness and justice, but he lacked self-control at this point. And so he was taking note of his fellow Hebrews' burdens, and it pained him to see his people under that kind of oppression, as it would. And so what we see is that when we try and figure out the solution without God's help, we make it worse a lot of the time. God has the ability to take something and transform it into something spectacular. We typically do not have that ability to do that. So killing the Egyptian wasn't the only solution, even though that's the solution that Moses saw at the time. And so that's what he did. He killed this Egyptian thinking he was going to make things better. But it wasn't the only solution. The problem was bigger than what Moses could see and understand. The Hebrew people at this point lacked unity and faith. And so it wasn't just about freeing them, but it was about unifying them in faith and purpose, because their purpose is going to come from their faith. And so as Moses tried to arbitrate this argument, the men took no notice of his authority, and of course he leaves and flees because he's afraid of Pharaoh. And so there's the theory that perhaps Moses was acting in self-defense when he killed that Egyptian foreman, but I don't think so, and I don't think that's how the scriptures read personally. But I think regardless of why he killed him, he thought he was upholding justice and trying to rescue his people. But he ends up being rejected by the Hebrews and by the Egyptians, and so he flees to Midian. And so what we see is Moses' first 40 years were spent being influenced by Egyptian culture, and really specifically for political administration is what he was being trained for. God would take the next 40 years, because Moses isn't going to appear on the scene again for another 40 years. At that point, he's going to be 80. And God's going to build on his already, foundation of skills and abilities, and deepen his faith and use those skills for his purpose. So when we get into Exodus 2:6, it says, "Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and began to draw water and fill the troughs in order to water their father's flock. When some shepherds came and drove them away, Moses came up and defended them and then watered their flock. So when they came home, their father asked, 'Why have you come home so early today?' They said, 'An Egyptian man rescued us from the shepherds. He actually drew water for us and watered the flock.' And he said, 'Where is he? Why in the world didn't you call this man home so that he may eat with us?' Moses agreed to stay with him, and he gave him his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. When she bore a son, Moses named him Gershom, for he said, 'I have become a resident foreigner in a foreign land.'" So, just a little bit about the Mennonites. The Mennonites were descendants of Abraham and, I'm going to probably say this wrong, Keturah, his wife, after Sarah died. Abraham did marry after Sarah died, and he went on to have other children. And so Moses, again, is always trying to uphold justice wherever he went, and he's trying to help this group of women not be bullied by another group of shepherds. That was Moses' heart. That's a heart of Moses. Who can I help? Who needs justice? And so he had a love for righteousness, which I think is very important, and God can build on that. And so, of course, the girl's father desired to meet this man, because I think that type of heart was rare in that type of society, and I think it's rare in our type of society. And so eventually Moses married one of the daughters and had 2 sons. I find it very interesting that Moses is taken into the work of shepherding, because this is not the first shepherd that we see God use. In fact, Moses is not really regarded as a famous shepherd. King David is. But yet here Moses is, he's shepherding, and that's what he is led to. It's a solitude job that afforded him a lot of quiet time. time to reflect and learn God's voice. This is not the only time that God's going to pull a shepherd like that. Again, we'll see that in King David. And so I think this really helped shape Moses' wisdom and patience. And also God paired him up with Jethro, his father-in-law, who again was a very just man, and I believe a man who worshiped Yahweh. And so in verse 23 it says, during that long period of time the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned because of their slave labor. They cried out in their desperate cry, and it went up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the Israelites, and God understood. Now the NIV reads that a little differently. It says God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked on the Israelites, and he was concerned about them. The key words are that God heard, God remembered, God saw, which meant God was going to act. That's what that means. And so during Moses' 40-year absence, the Pharaoh that was on the throne died. But the oppression of the Israelites continued. In fact, it worsened. At this point, the Israelites begin to call out to God. Now, this is important because this is the only time so far in the book of Exodus that we see the Israelites begin to call on Yahweh for help. Very important that we notice that. It's not something they had done previously. And because they're crying out to God for help, they're asking him to bring a solution, he's going to respond to that, okay? And so God is going to intervene. And he doesn't intervene unless we ask him to, which is what the Israelites are doing right now. The last question I want to answer really quick is, why are the Israelites allowed to remain in such harsh conditions? And I believe it's faith development. I think God allows us to stay in certain conditions to develop our faith and our reliance on him, because sometimes that's what it takes. It takes us being in those kind of conditions for our faith to develop. And so at this point, that's what's going on with the Israelites. Their faith is being developed. God's pulling faith out of them. And then he's going to send Moses to be, their rescuer. He's going to use Moses to help rescue them. And so that is chapter 2. I just wanted to briefly and quickly go through it. We'll be getting into Exodus 3 and 4 this week. Until then, I hope you guys, again, love well and are loved well, pray, and spend time in the Word of God. And I hope I've given you some food for thought on Exodus 1 and 2. So until then, be happy.